My name is Dorothea Vaillancourt, and I am 81 years old, and I am speaking into this recorder on the morning of the 14th of March, sitting at the kitchen table of the house, where I nursed my husband through his last winter, and where I have lived alone since the February he died. I was a registered nurse for 42 years, the last 31 of them in the bush country of the Upper Abitibi, and I am the only person still living whose what happened in that back room of the Sainte Marguerite Camp Infirmary between the years of 1956 and 1974. The others are gone. Père Archambault went first, in the spring of 69, and then Yolande Uwele in the autumn of 83, and then my husband Fernand last February, and with him went the last witness, who had stood in that room alongside me, and seen what I saw, and held his tongue for the 30 years that followed. He made me promise I would not speak while he was alive. He was a private man, Fernand. Private in the way that men of his generation were private, and he did not want his name attached to something that could not be explained in plain language. I honored that promise for 47 years. I am 81 years old, and I am speaking now because there is no one left to ask me not to, and because I have been a nurse long enough to understand that things witnessed in the body should not be taken to the grave without record. I have a small tape recorder that belonged to my granddaughter, Solange, who left it here last summer when she visited and asked me to talk into it and tell her things she could keep. She did not know what I would tell it. She may not be prepared for what this contains, but I am telling it because it is true, and because the truth of it is not frightening, and because the world, as I have come to understand it in my old age, is more full than any of the training I received in Rouen, Noranda, prepared me to believe. I came to the Sainte Marguerite camp in the summer of 1954. I was 30 years old. I had been nursing for 7 years, and I had spent those 7 years on hospital wards in Val d'Or and Amos, which sounds like wilderness, but is not truly. Val d'Or has a cinema and a proper pharmacy and an ambulance that can reach you in under 20 minutes. What the logging companies were offering in the Abitibi interior in those years was different. A camp of 260 men, a 2-room infirmary, a supply run twice monthly, and the nearest hospital 117 kilometers of unpaved road away, 4 hours in dry conditions and 6 in mud season. What they were offering, in other words, was the practice of medicine, the way medicine had been practiced for most of human history, which is to say, alone, with what you had, and with the full weight of the decision landing on your own hands and your own judgment, with no one to consult and no one to countermand you. I took the position because I was young enough to believe I was capable of it, and experienced enough to know that I was not, and that the gap between those two things was where the real education was waiting. The camp sat on the western shore of Lac Sainte Marguerite, which is not on any tourist map, because there is nothing there to recommend to tourists except the water and the timber and the particular quality of silence that falls over that country in the deep of winter, when the temperature drops below 40 below, and even the ravens go quiet. The infirmary occupied the east end of the main longhouse, separated from the dormitory by a single partition wall, and a door that the men knocked on at all hours for sprains and cuts, and the occasional broken finger, and the more occasional thing that could not be set right with what I had in the cabinet. The back room had been a storage space when I arrived. The previous nurse, a man named Dumont, who had been there 8 years and left without giving reasons, had used it to store extra cot mattresses and canned goods against the possibility of a long quarantine. I cleared it out in my first autumn, replaced the mattresses with the ones from the cots that had dry rot, and used the room for cases I wanted to observe overnight. That is what the back room was officially. A ward, an observation space, a place where a man with a high fever or a man whose breathing I did not like could sleep close enough to me that I could hear him through the wall. What it became between 1956 and 1974 was something I have never been able to name in any medical language I know, and I am going to describe it as plainly as I can and leave the naming to whoever listens to this tape. The first time was the spring of 1956. I had been at St. Margaret for 2 years, and I knew the country around the camp well enough to walk it without a guide, which I did. Most mornings before the men woke, because the silence and the spruce and the particular light off the lake at dawn were the best compensation the camp offered for everything it lacked. On the morning of the 3rd of April, I was walking the south trail that follows the lake shore toward the cut block. The crew had been working since January, and I found the animal caught. I use the word animal deliberately, and I use it with respect, because at that moment, in the grey light before full sunrise, that is what I understood what I was seeing to be. Something very large, caught in the chain from one of the cable yarding rigs the crew had left on the trail overnight. The cable had fouled around the left ankle. The foot had gone into a depression in the frozen ground. And in pulling to get free, the creature had twisted the joint in a way that I recognized from training as a significant ligament injury. It lay on its left side in the snow, and it was not fighting the cable anymore. It was still, and its stillness had in it a quality that I associate, as a nurse, not with death but with the moment before pain becomes overwhelming, and the body makes the decision to stop moving in order to keep the pain from getting worse. I know that stillness. I have sat beside it many times. It is not the stillness of an animal that does not understand what has happened to it. It is the stillness of something that understands exactly and is deciding what to do next. It was between 8 and 9 feet tall, lying on its side. It had dark brown fur from the crown of its head to its feet, the fur thicker at the shoulders and chest, and thinner at the face, and the face was broad and flat and very calm, with eyes that I can only describe as attentive, the way a person's eyes are attentive when they are trying to decide whether to trust you. I stood on the trail, and it looked at me, and I looked at it, and neither of us moved. And that lasted perhaps 2 minutes, which is a very long time to stand in the cold at 5 in the morning, looking at something that should not exist and finding, to your considerable surprise, that you are not afraid. I have thought about that first morning for 27 years. I have thought about why I was not afraid. And the only answer I have arrived at is that there was nothing in front of me that offered any reason for fear. It was hurt. It was cold. It was looking at me the way a creature looks at you when it is deciding whether to ask for help. And there is no translation difficulty in that expression, no matter what species is wearing it. I have seen it on men. I have seen it on children. I have seen it on old women who have lived long enough to believe that asking for help is a form of defeat, and who ask anyway, with their eyes, before their mouths form the words. I went back to the infirmary. I came back with my bag and a pair of cable cutters from the tool shed, and I cut the chain close to the ankle, and then I knelt in the snow and examined what the cable had done. The ankle joint was swollen already, which told me the injury was at least several hours old, and the range of motion was severely limited. And there was a laceration along the lateral malleolus, where the cable had cut through the fur and the skin. I cleaned the laceration with what I had in my bag, which was carbolic solution and clean gauze, and I bandaged it as firmly as I could, with the creature lying still and allowing me to work. And then I sat back and looked at it, and it looked at me. And I said, in French, because that is what I spoke, that it was going to need to keep the weight off that ankle for several weeks. If the ligament was going to heal properly, which I acknowledged was an absurd thing to say to something that could not respond in kind. But I said it because it was true, and because I have always found it easier to work if I am speaking aloud to whatever I am working on, human or otherwise. It did not stand immediately. It lay there for another few minutes, and I sat in the snow beside it, which was cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not cold enough to be dangerous. And then it put one enormous hand flat on the ground and pushed itself to sitting, and it looked at the bandaged ankle with an expression that was so plainly evaluative, so clearly the expression of something assessing the quality of a repair, that I almost laughed, which would have been the wrong thing entirely. It put a hand to the bandage very carefully, the way a patient does when they are testing whether you wrapped it too tight or not tight enough. Then it looked at me, and then, slowly and with obvious difficulty, it stood. It stood, and I stood, and it was more than a head taller than me, even with the weight off the injured side. And I looked up at it, and it looked down at me, and the light had come up enough by then that I could see it clearly, all the details I would record in my own private notes that evening. The breadth of the shoulders, the length of the arms, the quality of the fur in the morning light, which was dark brown at the roots, and tipped with something almost auburn where the sun caught it, the eyes, which were dark and very quiet, and which held mine for a long moment before it turned and moved into the spruce, slowly, favouring the left ankle, and was gone. I went back to the infirmary, and I wrote down what I had seen and what I had done, and I put the notes in the same place. I kept the notes I did not want anyone else to read, which was inside the cover of my professional register at the back, because no one ever looks in a nurse's professional register except the nurse. And then I started the morning routine, and I said nothing to anyone. I would like to tell you that I was confident and purposeful from that first morning, that I understood what the years ahead held and moved into them deliberately. I was not. I was a nurse in a bush camp, with no doctor and no radio and 60 kilometers of unbroken forest in every direction. And what I understood in the spring of 1956 was exactly what I had seen, and nothing more. I had found an injured animal. I had treated the injury. The animal had gone back into the forest. There was nothing in that sequence that any nurse in my position would not have done, given the materials at hand and the training in her body, except perhaps that most nurses would not have been alone on the trail at 5 in the morning with cable cutters in their bag. The ankle healed. I know this because I saw the creature again in June of that same year, on the same south trail, and it walked without favouring the left side, and it stopped when it saw me, and it stood at the edge of the trees for a long moment and then moved on. That was all, but it was enough. I understood from that second sighting that I had been recognised, and that recognition had been allowed to stand. The first time I brought one of them into the infirmary was the winter of 1958. I need to explain the circumstances because they were not simple and the decision was not made quickly or lightly. A man named Gérard Fontaine, who ran the cable yarding crew and who was one of the 3 men at the camp I trusted completely, came to the infirmary on a Wednesday evening in January and told me that there was a problem in the south cut block and that he needed me to come and look at it and that he could not explain what the problem was before I saw it for myself. Gérard was 62 years old, a man who had been in the bush his entire working life and who had the particular calmness of men who have dealt with every kind of emergency the forest offers and have learned to sort what is urgent from what is merely serious. He was serious that evening, not urgent, which told me no one was dying. He was also uneasy in a way I had not seen in him before, which told me whatever was in the south cut block was outside the range of what his experience had prepared him for. We walked to the cut block in the dark, and there was another man waiting at the edge of the trees. Fernand, who was then the camp's head faller, and who would become my husband 4 years later, though I did not know that yet. Fernand was 35, tall, and he had the expression of a man who had decided to believe something he had not previously believed, and was still finding his footing in that decision. He nodded at me and then gestured with his flashlight toward the far side of the cut block, where the timber had been cleared back enough that the moonlight came through, and I saw what they had brought me to see. There were 2 of them. One was sitting with its back against a spruce that stood at the timber edge, and the other was on the ground beside it, and the one on the ground was injured in a way that I could assess from 20 meters. The right arm hung at an angle that was not the arm's natural angle, and there was blood on the fur of the chest and shoulder that had frozen in the cold into a dark stiff patch, a saw blade. I had treated the same injury on men, a saw blade that swings wide and catches the upper arm and shoulder, not deeply enough to kill immediately, but deeply enough to be serious, and in the cold, in the bush, without treatment, eventually fatal. How it had happened, and when it had happened, I did not know and could not know. What I knew was the arm and the shoulder and the cold and the blood and the time that had already passed. I said to Gérard that I needed them brought to the back room of the infirmary. He looked at me for a long time. I said that the one on the ground was going to die if we left it where it was, and that I did not have the equipment in my bag to treat a wound that size in the open air in January, and that the back room had a cot and a lamp and heat, which was what I needed, and that I was asking him to help me get them there. He looked at Fernand, and Fernand looked at the 2 figures at the edge of the timber, and then he looked at me and he said, simply, "All right." It took an hour. The one that was seated rose when we approached, and I spoke to it in a low voice, the way you speak to something that is frightened and in pain, and trying to decide whether to run, and it did not run, and it allowed Gérard to get a shoulder under the injured one's right side, and Fernand under the left, and the 4 of us came back through the cut block and across the yard, and through the back door of the infirmary into the light and the warmth, and I closed the door and I went to work. The laceration ran from the midpoint of the upper arm across the deltoid and onto the shoulder blade, and it was 8 inches long, and in places an inch deep, and it had been made by something with a straight, fine edge that had struck at an angle. My best assessment was a falling saw blade, the kind that can snap free of the bar and carry a significant distance. The blade had not caught the brachial artery, which was the thing that mattered most, and the cold had slowed the bleeding enough that the blood loss, though serious, was not yet critical. I cleaned the wound with what I had, and I sutured it in sections, which took 2.5 hours, and the creature lay on the cot on its side, and held still with a quality of stillness that told me it was in significant pain, and was choosing to bear it, which is a choice, in my experience, not an absence of feeling. The other one sat in the corner on the floor. The other one was smaller, which I noted and recorded, and which I have thought about many times since. Whether smaller meant younger, whether younger meant what it would mean in a human context, I did not know, and did not ask, because there was no one to ask, and no framework in any textbook I had ever read to answer the question. It sat in the corner and watched me work, and it made no sound, and occasionally it made a low resonant sound in its chest that I came to understand, over many years, was the sound these creatures make when they are managing distress. Not a sound of alarm, but a sound of endurance, the way a person hums them to themselves when they are waiting in pain for something to be done. Gérard sat in the room with me through the suturing, and Fernand stood outside the door. And when I had finished and dressed the wound, and covered the injured one with the 2 wool blankets from the supply shelf, I went out and I told Fernand what I had done, and I told him what I needed him to do, which was to tell no one, not a man in the camp, not anyone outside the camp, not a family member, not a priest. He was a Catholic man of deep conviction, Fernand, and I watched him think about that for a long moment. And then he said, "I have not seen anything tonight that a priest needs to know about." That was the first lie. There would be many more. The injured one remained in the back room for 9 days. I will not say that 9 days is long by any clinical standard, for the kind of wound I had sutured. 9 days is short, in fact, for a laceration, that deep with that much tissue involvement. And the speed of the healing was something I recorded carefully and have never been able to explain in terms available to me. The sutures held. The swelling reduced at a rate I would not have predicted. By the 4th day, the creature was sitting up, and by the 7th, it was standing. And on the 9th morning, when I came in, it was at the back door, which it had been able to open by pressing the latch. And it stood in the doorway in the cold air and looked at me, and the smaller one was in the yard outside, waiting. I unwrapped the dressing and examined the shoulder and the arm, and the healing was sufficient. Not complete, but sufficient for what the bush requires, which is range of motion and the absence of sepsis and the ability to move without tearing. What has been repaired? I said this to the 2 of them in the doorway, and then I said what I had said 2 years earlier on the South Trail, which was that the arm needed rest and limited movement for at least another 3 weeks, and that I was aware this was difficult advice to take seriously in the circumstances. The injured one put one hand briefly to the doorframe, which was not a grip but a touch, and then they went into the yard and across the yard and into the trees. I went inside and sat at my desk for a long time, and then I went and told Gérard what had happened and what I expected might happen next, and he listened, and when I finished, he said, "You are a good nurse, Dorothea." He said this the way a man says a thing when he is using a small true statement to stand in for a larger thing he does not have the words for. I understood him. What happened next, across the years that followed, was not a single event, but an accumulation. I want to be precise about this, because I know how stories like mine are told, from the outside, and the telling from the outside always compresses what was slow and continuous into something that sounds like incident, like episodes with clear boundaries. It was not like that. It was the way nursing is, a practice, a discipline, a dailiness, a set of skills that you carry in your body and apply when the body in front of you requires them, without drama, without announcement. It happened 12 times over those 18 years. 12 is the number I know with certainty because I have the notes, all of them kept in the professional register in the same handwriting, dated and detailed, the way I was trained to record everything I did and saw and decided. Because a nurse's record is her only defense in a world that will question her, judgment before it questions anyone else's. The injuries were of three kinds, and I have thought about this pattern many times since I retired. The first kind was logging machinery, saw blades and cable yarding chains, and the hooks and blocks that swing when the load shifts, the same things that injured the men I treated in the infirmary. Through the daylight hours, except that the men came to me because the camp was theirs and the forest was their workplace. And these creatures came because Gerard or Fanon found them and came for me, or because, over the years, I began to find them myself when I walked the trails in the early morning. The second kind was the cold, frostbite and hypothermia, and in one case, the winter of 1963, something that presented as pneumonia and that I treated with what I had, which was not much, and which resolved over 14 days in the back room in a way I cannot account for except to say that it did. The third kind, 3 times in 18 years, was injury from other logging crews operating north of the camp boundary, crews I did not know and had no authority over, and I will not describe those injuries in detail except to say that they were the hardest to treat and the hardest to carry afterward, because the hardest injuries to carry are always the ones that did not have to happen. Yolande Ouellet came to the infirmary as a cook's assistant in the summer of 1961. She was 24 years old, a large-framed woman from Lac Saint-Jean with steady hands, and a composure that I recognized immediately as the composure of someone who has seen something before they had the vocabulary for it and has been waiting quietly for the vocabulary to arrive. She had been in the kitchen 6 months when she knocked on the infirmary door one evening and said that she had seen what came in and out of the back room and that she wanted to help. I told her she had not seen anything because that is what you say first. She said that she had, in fact, and that she was not frightened, and that she was stronger than she looked, which was a considerable understatement. I looked at her for a long time, and she looked back at me with a steadiness that I have rarely encountered, and I said, "All right." She was at every treatment after that for the next 13 years until the camp closed. And her particular gift was the gift of arriving with food, which she did every time without being asked, because she understood, before I did that, an injured creature being treated in an unfamiliar enclosed space is far more likely to remain still and allow the treatment if it is warm and not hungry, which is true of humans as well, and ought to be codified somewhere in the literature. I want to say something about Père Archambault, who was the camp's Catholic chaplain from 1957 until his death in the spring of '69. He was 68 years old when he came to the camp, which was old for that work, and he had been a missionary priest in the north for 30 years and had the bearings of a man who has long since made his peace with the distance between the catechism and the world as it actually presents itself. He found out about the back room in the winter of 1959, not because anyone told him, but because he was an early riser and a light sleeper, and the camp was not large. He came to me the morning after and sat down across the table and was quiet for a long time, and then he said that he had been praying for 40 years to encounter something that exceeded his understanding, and that he was grateful the prayer had been answered, and that he would not speak of it outside this room. He never did. He came sometimes in the evenings, when one of them was in the back room recovering, and he sat in the corner the way Yolande sat, quietly and without intruding. And I believed then, and believe now, that what he was doing was praying, which seemed to me as good and useful a thing as anything else available to him. The camp closed in the autumn of 1974. The company that owned it had sold the cutting rights to a larger company based in Montreal, and the larger company brought in equipment that required fewer men. And the settlement around the camp, which had grown over 20 years to include a small school and a post office and the infirmary, was dismantled in a single season. I have never been back. The road was closed to vehicles in 1979, and the forest has been reclaiming it since then. I know this from a man I met at a nursing conference in Rouen, who had been in that country recently, and he said the alders had taken the road back to the waterline, and you would not know now that there had been a camp there at all. This is not sad to me. Places are for what they are needed for, and when the need is finished, the forest does what it has always done, which is grow. I moved with Fernand to Amos after the camp closed, and I nursed there for another 17 years until my retirement in 1991, and I did not speak of Sainte Marguerite to anyone I worked with in Amos, because there was nothing in the language of the Amos nursing station that had room for what I had done at Sainte Marguerite. It was not that I was ashamed. I was not ashamed. I was precise enough in my professional habits to understand the difference between a thing being true and a thing being appropriate to discuss in a particular context, and the particular context of a district nursing station in a town with a functioning hospital and ambulance service was not the context for the story of the back room at Sainte Marguerite. I kept the professional register. I kept the notes. I carried them in my work bag for 17 years. In Amos, the way you carry something you cannot put down, even when it would be more convenient to put it down. Fernand knew, of course. He had been there from the beginning, from the night in the South Cut Block in January of '58, and over the years of our marriage, he was the person I could speak to about it. When the speaking became necessary, which it did from time to time, because there are things you have witnessed that require a witness to your witnessing, someone who can confirm that the memory you carry is a memory and not something your mind assembled in the long absence of confirmation. He was that for me. He said very little about it, being Fernand, but what he said was always sufficient. He said once, lying awake in the dark in the early years of our marriage, that the thing that stayed with him was the stillness, the quality of deliberate stillness in the back room, the patience of it, and that it reminded him of the patience he had watched in old men who had been seriously hurt before, and understood that healing requires time, and that the only contribution you can make to your own healing is to stop fighting the time it takes. He said this, without mysticism and without sentiment, as a practical observation, from a man who had worked in the bush for 30 years, and had been hurt himself twice, and had watched the healing of his own body with the attention of a practical man to a practical process. I thought then, and think now that he was right, and that the observation was the most accurate thing I could add to any medical record of those years, if there had been a medical record to add it to. In the last years, after the children had grown and moved to the cities, and Fernand's health had begun the long, slow work of failing, we talked about the back room more than we ever had before. He said once that he wished there were a way to let it be known without it being taken from us, which is the exact problem. Put exactly, there is no way to let a thing like that be known without it being taken, catalogued, explained, disputed, claimed, and eventually stripped of the specific human texture of what it actually was, which was this. A nurse in a bush camp, alone in the early mornings, with a medical kit and steady hands, and the professional habit of looking at what is in front of her and doing what the situation requires. That is all it was, from my side. I imagine it was something different from the other side, but I have no access to that, and I have learned, over a long life of nursing, that the most honest thing you can do is stay on your side of the knowledge you actually possess. The last time was in the summer of 1973, the year before the camp closed. It was a juvenile, I am certain of it. The size was wrong for an adult, and the face had the particular, unfinished quality of something still growing into its own proportions. It had a deep cut on the left hand, the kind of cut that happens when a hand closes around something edged without anticipating the edge, and the cut had been wrapped in bark and moss and plant material in a way that showed an understanding of the principle of pressure, and covering even if the materials were not sterile, which they were not. I cleaned the wound and sutured it with 4 stitches, and the juvenile sat on the cot with the same stillness I had seen in the adults, the same quality of endurance and patience, and when I had finished, it looked at the hand and then at me, and it made the low, resonant sound. Once, that was not quite a note and not quite a word, and Yolande, who was in the corner as she always was, said quietly that she had heard that sound before, and that she believed it was the same every time, and that it meant something specific. I told her I believed the same. I do not know what it means. I have thought about it for more than 50 years. I do not know. But I know it is specific, and I know it is directed, and I know that it was directed at me. On 7 of the 12 occasions, I treated an injury in that room, always at the end, always once, and that whatever it means, it meant the same thing every time. Yolande died in the autumn of '83. She was 46 years old, which was too young, a thing I have never made my peace with and do not expect to before I die. She lived for 9 years after. The camp closed in a small house in Saint Félicien with a garden she was proud of and a series of cats she named after, French-Canadian historical figures, which was her own private joke that she explained to no one. She was the best assistant I ever worked with, and she never sought recognition for it, not because she was modest, but because she understood that the work was its own recognition, and that looking for acknowledgement outside the work itself was a way of not trusting the work. I admired that in her. I have tried to emulate it with varying success for the 40-odd years since I lost her. Père Archambault died in the spring of '69, 4 years before the camp closed, at the age of 78, in the infirmary, in the front room, in the cot closest to the window, and he was at peace in the way that old men who have lived their beliefs are sometimes at peace, without drama and without complaint. He said nothing, in the days before his death, about the back room, but he held my hand when I sat with him, and I believe He was thinking about it, the way I was thinking about it, not with anxiety, not with mystery, but with a simple, clear gratitude for having been present at something that exceeded the ordinary dimensions of a life. Fernand died in February, as I said. I sat with him the way I had sat with Père Archambault, and he said very little in the end, which was how Fernand had always preferred to spend his words, carefully and without waste. He said, the morning of the day he died, that he thought the world was still full of what we had seen, that it had not gone away simply because we could not see it anymore, and that this seemed to him a reasonable thing to believe, not on the basis of faith, but on the basis of the evidence of his own eyes. I told him I agreed. He said, you should say so then, before you cannot. I think about that every day. So I am saying so. The back room of the Sainte Marguerite Infirmary was a ward. I used it as a ward from 1956 to 1974, and I treated 12 injuries over those 18 years. And the patients were not human, and the treatments worked, and the patients recovered and returned to the forest, and were not seen again, except twice, when one returned to the South Trail, and I recognized it by its gait and the particular set of its shoulders, and it stopped and stood for a long moment before moving on, and the second time I recognized the recognition in it, and I stood still and let it look at me, and I looked back, and that was all either of us needed. I do not know what they are. I have not known for 67 years, and I will not know before I die. And this does not trouble me in the way it might trouble someone who has not spent a lifetime in medicine. Medicine is full of things we treat, without knowing what they are in their full nature. We treat the symptom, we address the damage, we support the healing process, and the healing process does what healing processes do, which is proceed according to its own logic, which is not always the logic we have been taught. This is not a mystery I find frightening. I find it enlarging. I find it the most honest possible description of what the work of nursing actually is, which is to stand at the edge of what you understand and do what you can with what you have, and to trust that what you cannot explain is not therefore false. The professional register is in the drawer of this table. The notes are all there, in my handwriting, dated from the 3rd of April, 1956, to the 22nd of August, 1973. I am leaving this tape and the register together, and I am leaving them to Solange, who asked me to speak into the recorder and tell her things she could keep. I hope she is old enough. I hope she understands that the reason I am telling her this is not because it is strange, but because it is true, and because the true things are the ones that should be kept, even when they are the ones that have no name. The recorder is sitting on the table beside the window, and the sun is coming in from the east, the way it came in at Sainte Marguerite in the early mornings when I walked the South Trail, and the light came off the water, and the spruce stood in, rows so straight and so dark that they looked like a wall, and were one, truly, a wall between the world I lived in and the world that lay beyond it, both of them real, both of them present, neither of them requiring my understanding in order to continue. The sun is the same sun. I am older than I was. The notes are in the drawer, the tape is in the recorder, and the forest, wherever it is still itself, is full of what I saw and has been all along.